Okay, this is Unit 2, which is to do with truth-telling and informed consent. Those are the topics that we're specifically looking at and that you've read articles specifically about. However, the main point of this unit, really, is to introduce the notions that are core concepts in ethics in general, but especially in bioethics and medical ethics, of autonomy on the one hand and paternalism on the other. So let's say a little bit about those to begin with. Autonomy, the roots of the word are auto for self and nomi for law. And basically it means making laws for yourself or being self-governing. And the idea is that a person is autonomous when he or she is in control of themselves. Now, the way I've just described it was descriptively. That tells you when someone is autonomous. But it is seen as an important value, that is a normative fact. It is seen by a variety of ethicists, of philosophers who write on ethics, as being enormously important and being a fundamental human value. Among the people that we spoke about in Unit 1, perhaps the most famous for promoting the importance of autonomy is the philosopher Immanuel Kant. You might remember that his fundamental rule was called the Categorical Imperative, and confusingly it could be interpreted in, well, he said 3 ways, and we looked at 2 of them. And the second of those is the one that really stresses autonomy. It says that we should treat people as never as a means only, but as an end in themselves, that they have value inherently in themselves. And the reason for this, according to Kant, is because individuals that we should treat this way have free will. They are able to make choices and control themselves. So autonomy and choice are very closely related, like that, basically. You are autonomous if you can choose for yourself, it is usually thought. Now, a philosopher whose theory is usually taken to be rather opposed to Kant's because he was a utilitarian is John Stuart Mill, who of course you read an excerpt for this unit. But Mill's theory is complex. His 2 great works in ethics were on the one hand called utilitarianism, where he lays out his version of utilitarianism, the theory that the right action is the one that maximizes happiness. That is a consequentialist theory. And of course Kant's theory is a rule-based or deontological theory. For Kant, the intentions are all important. For consequentialist theories, it's the consequences that matter. And these are usually seen as sort of opposite ends of the spectrum in ethics. But Mill's other great work, which is what you had an excerpt from, is called On Liberty. And there he defends the importance of humans being able to choose for themselves in various areas. One area of particular concern in that book is freedom of expression, and he talks a lot about that. But also another area is freedom of planning your life, of living as you choose, where he says there's great value to having a variety of lifestyles. Mill was writing in Victorian times, but he comes across as sort of a proto-hippie, that is, people living radically alternative lifestyles is a good thing, according to Mill. Now, we'll go into his argument in a little bit. He does defend his defense of autonomy on utilitarian grounds, or at least he claims to. But it's interesting that both of these otherwise opposed philosophers defend the value of autonomy. However, consequentialists often defend paternalism. And paternalism is the idea that it is sometimes ethical to act towards another person as a parent acts towards their children, hence paternalism. And how is a parent supposed to act towards their children? They're supposed to look out for the good of their children when their children might not be able to do that for themselves, or might make choices that are not in their own best interests. So, for example, parents are supposed to say, if you look on online, there's all sorts of videos of dad reflexes or mom reflexes where kids are about to do something terribly life-endangering, like fly off a swing, or they fall off a ladder or something, and the parent dives and catches them just in time, because I don't want to watch the videos where they don't catch them. And that's what parents are supposed to do. They're supposed to protect children from stupid choices or from bad consequences of their actions. And in fact, parents are supposed to prevent their children from even getting to do things that the parent knows will be bad for them. So they don't let them eat candy all the time. They make them go to school when they don't want to go to school, things like that. Even when school is over Zoom, as at the moment. So paternalism is the idea that it is justifiable to control people in a way so long as it's for their own good. Normally, we would say controlling people is immoral because we tend to think that the reason you control people is for your own good and not for the good of the people you're controlling. So, when a corrupt leader manipulates his or her subjects to pursue something that is in the good of the corrupt ruler, by taxing them exorbitantly or something like that, that's seen as a bad thing. But paternalism, to be paternalistic, you must be doing things for the good of the person that you're manipulating. And you can see, of course, that this would clearly apply to doctors, because doctors are supposed to be, and according to the Hippocratic Oath, doctors or physicians in general, doctors and nurses, of course, are supposed to be acting in the best interests of the patient. And often, as you will discover if you go into healthcare, the patient resists and wants to do things that are not in their own best interests. And of course, we're getting a classic example of this right now with the coronavirus pandemic, where we see all these people who are sick and tired of staying inside, and they want to go to restaurants. They seem to be obsessed with getting their hair done. That's the number one thing. People want a haircut. Solution: cut your own hair, as I have done for 25 years. Then it's no worry. But of course, some people want a better haircut than this. So there are all these people storming the capitals, our own capital, Lansing in particular, demanding to be let out, demanding for the restrictions that have been imposed to fight the pandemic to be lifted. And all of the healthcare workers, particularly the ones who've been on the front lines of fighting coronavirus, who've seen all the people dying of it in hospitals, are appalled at this. They are saying, oh my God, you've just made my job 10 times worse. This is just as we were getting this under control. You're going to explode the cases and it's going to be crazy. We saw in China because they have an authoritarian system of government, they were able to be a lot more strict than they've been in the United States. People were literally locked in their buildings. There were cases where the doors of apartment buildings were welded shut, and loudspeakers placed on the street telling them what they could do and when they could do it. And generally, the police crack down. Actually, I have conversations with my relatives in England, and it's more authoritarian even there. The home of John Stuart Mill, who advocates for freedom and liberty. And you're allowed out for one walk a day, and if you try to have a second walk a day and the police capture you, you can get a ticket. And you're only allowed to go to the store a certain amount of times a week. You can't go every day. And all these kinds of restrictions. And if you're going somewhere in your car and you're stopped, you have to have a damn good explanation of where you're going. You can't just say, oh, I fancied a bit of a drive around. You've got to be going to do something important like your weekly shop or whatever. So these are much more paternalistic measures. And it seems like certainly medical professionals are much more likely to know what is in the good of their patient than the patient themselves. Otherwise, why go to a doctor at all? So, and if you, among the readings that we went through, the very first reading on truth-telling, which advocated against doctors telling the truth, was very paternalistic. It justified not telling the truth for patients. Essentially, in the words of Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, because they can't handle the truth. And it will do them more harm than good if you tell them the truth. And we'll look at some of the examples that Collins gives in that article. So those are the sort of two competing values. The respecting the autonomy of the patient, and obviously if you respect the autonomy of the patient, this requires telling him or her the truth, because you can only choose and make an informed choice if you are treated as someone who is to be respected. Now, obviously, parents, much as they probably would deny it, lie to kids all the time. I mean, Santa Claus is a lie, for one thing. And no parent sees a problem with that, of just lying to their kids about Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy or whatever. Why? Because it's sweet, it's nice. That's very paternalistic. You're saying, I'm going to give my kid this sort of fantasy that they will enjoy, but it requires me lying to them. And that's perfectly okay. Why? Because they're a kid. But if you lie to an adult, that's seen as much more serious. And that's something that Mill brings up, that we regard children as not yet capable of autonomy. They're not in control of their actions. This is why children are not prosecuted in the same way that adults are in the legal system. If a child commits a murder, they don't get the same penalties as an adult would. Because we believe that they don't really have an understanding of right and wrong yet. So children and adults are held to a different standard. And of course, there are some adults who are at the mental level of a child. Some people who are, for whatever reason, incapacitated. And we don't think that they will ever be capable of autonomous decisions. And for them, we think it's perfectly appropriate to act in their interests and not let them decide. But real paternalism is when we do that for adults who in other respects are allowed to choose for themselves, who have driver's licenses, who can get married, who could join the army, whatever, can make choices, life-affecting choices. And yet we think that it's okay to manipulate them if it's for their own good. When is this justifiable? Is it ever justifiable? So those are the issues of autonomy and paternalism. And it's typically consequentialists who argue for paternalism. And as we shall see, Collins does exactly that. He argues for not telling the truth. In fact, let's look at Collins's article right now. Let's talk about the issue of telling the truth to patients. So Joseph Collins answers his own question, should doctors tell the truth, in the negative. And he says, this article is from the early 20th century, and it's it's pretty obvious that it is very dated, including some of the terminology. The last case he discusses involves a man marrying a woman who's clearly a lesbian, and the terminology he uses to describe being a lesbian, while on the one hand non-judgmental, which makes it rather progressive for the time, is laden with sort of value judgments about it being kind of a tragedy that this woman is gay. But I do love his phrase, strange sisterhood, that this woman was part of the strange sisterhood. It sounds like a group of female superheroes, like the Suicide Squad or something. It sounds really cool. So Joseph Collins has some kind of archaic turns of phrase, which are sometimes rather amusing. But this is a quote. "The physician soon learns that the art of medicine consists largely in skillfully mixing falsehood and truth in order to provide the patient with an amalgam, a mixture, which will make the metal of life wear and keep men from being poor, shrunken things, full of melancholy and indisposition." That's on page 613. What's he saying? He's saying that it's the physician's duty to try and keep his patients happy. Obviously, it's the physician's duty to try and keep them healthy, but healthy and happy are both goals. And in fact, later on in the article, what does he say? He says, if the patient can be induced to live decorously, the physician has discharged his obligation. This is page 619. Induced, basically tricked. If a patient can be manipulated into living the right way, into following a healthy diet or healthy plan of life, then that's what the physician should be trying to do. It's not the physician's business to just bluntly tell the truth. They don't have to. Their job is like a parent to a child. It's to make sure that the patient is healthy and has as high a quality of life as possible. When you know that they're going to die, as we saw in the example of the advertiser, the artist who turned to advertising, who was going to die of cancer, don't tell him the truth, because if you tell him the truth, he'll be miserable and he won't make use of his last year of life. So this is, Collins is arguing in a very consequentialist manner that when you get better results in terms of the health and happiness of the patient, absolutely lie away. And he argues for this by saying, look, I've practiced for 40 years and I know that that of the patients who say, tell me the truth, I want to hear the truth, they fall into 4 categories. He said the most common is those who aren't really very sick. And he later goes on to say, it's the ones who aren't very sick who are most vociferous about telling the truth. The ones who are sick kind of clam up and don't tend to ask as many questions, precisely because they don't want to hear the truth. So that is added by him to lend weight to this idea that patients say they want to hear the truth, but they don't really. It's kind of unpleasant echoes of, the old attitude about wooing a woman, that men were supposed to, if they say no, they don't really mean it, and that just means you've got to persuade them. It sounds a little bit like that, and thankfully that's a thing of the past. Well, it's supposed to be. Okay, so the vast majority of those who aren't very sick. Okay. And those you can tell the truth anyway, because they want to hear the truth. And if they're not very sick, you can tell them. And sometimes they don't believe you that they're not very sick, as in the case of the professor that he met in Germany. But those aren't really problematic. And of course, there's the first kind who say, tell me the truth, and they honestly mean it, and they want you to tell them the worst news, and they can handle it. But he says those people are incredibly rare. He says you can count them on the fingers of one hand, how many I've had in 40 years, people who could handle the truth. So clearly this guy has a very low opinion of patients. The vast majority of those who are actually sick fall into category 2 or 3. 2 is those who don't want to know and would be injured by the truth. And he says 3 is those who are incapable of receiving it. I presume those... I think Higgs mentions that there are categories of people who literally, when you tell them the truth, they report not having heard it. It's as if their brain can't process such bad news, and presumably that's what Collins means by his third category of patients. But the majority of people who are actually sick, when they say, tell me the truth, they don't want to know, and he says they would be injured by the truth. Now, he does say that there are bad lies. On page 617, he says, bad lies that the doctor or physician should never tell are pretending to recognize the disease when you don't really, taking credit for the cure when it's really nature that's cured them, claiming that an incurable disease can be cured. They say, you got pancreatic cancer, but don't worry, we'll fix it. Pronouncing a disease incurable when that's not proven. And in fact, that's a point that he returns to a lot. He says one of the problems with doctors telling the truth as it stands now is that medical science is always changing. I remember, because I'm old, when Magic Johnson gave a news conference to say that he was HIV positive. And this was when he was still playing for the Lakers. The Lakers had just been in the finals, lost to the Bulls because Magic and Byron Scott got injured. And maybe Michael Jordan had something to do with it. So the Lakers were a title team. And Magic comes out and says, I've got HIV. And everybody thought, well, that's it for Magic, because Eazy-E of NWA had announced that he was HIV positive and then was dead in a week. And that was generally the prognosis back then. So everybody expected that, we would watch Magic get skinnier and die, kind of like what happened to Freddie Mercury. Or maybe he'd just vanish and we'd, hear that he died later. But at that time, there was an experimental regimen of HIV drugs, and he was, because of his training, he was able to keep to the... At the time, you had to take ridiculous numbers of injections and pills at exactly the right time of day. And because he was used to a very rigidly structured lifestyle, or because he was a very well-organized person, he stuck to it much better than most people, and he's still perfectly healthy today. And now, of course, the drugs are much more simple to take, and it's easier to be HIV positive. It's still not a good thing, but it's not a death sentence. But I'm sure most physicians at the time thought that he was going to die. And if they told him, make peace with your family because that's it for you, Magic, it wouldn't have been a good thing. This is what Collins wants to say about you can't really know, you can't really tell the truth because you don't really know. But of course what Higgs in the second article says is saying I don't know is telling the truth. Don't confuse the fact that the truth is hard with that meaning that it's impossible to tell the truth. No, it's perfectly easy to tell the truth as you know it. If the truth is this is an area where we can't be certain, then you can just we can say lots of people, the majority of people die of this, but medical technology is changing. There are some promising treatments. That's telling the truth. But just saying, oh, you'll be fine, or saying you don't have anything, just please don't have sex with anyone from now on. That is not acceptable according to Higgs. Okay, so Collins gives, so those were bad lies. Collins also gives reasons not to tell the truth. What is incurable today may not be soon. Of course, that's not a reason not to tell the truth. That's a reason to truthfully say things change. There is a great variety across cases. Doctors honestly can't be certain. Again, you can say you're not certain, is what Higgs would say. You can say, for other people, this has been fatal. Now, Collins says sometimes telling part of the truth is important to get patients to change their ways. For example, the point, remember, for Collins, is to get patients healthy. And this may require them changing their lifestyle and taking medicines and undergoing treatments and changing their diet. How are you going to get them to do that if you say you're fine? Because if you're fine, they don't need to change their life. So he says, tell them that, they're a little bit sick, or that they're sick of something that requires a change of lifestyle, and then that's enough. And he suggests later on, as for example, in his first case, the man with rheumatism, who actually had something called locomotor ataxia, which was a spinal cord disease. I don't know if that's still considered a thing. But this guy claimed to have rheumatism, and Collins told him to change treatment to this treatment that actually treated locomotor ataxia, and notes that this guy never asked him why. So Collins is suggesting that subconsciously patients want you to lie to them, and they just don't want to ask questions. As he sort of implies, it's freaking obvious that this is not treatment for rheumatism. And if the guy really wanted the truth, he would have said, hey, what's the deal with this treatment? But clearly the guy didn't really want the truth. He just wanted to be given a treatment. And now he's still alive at 70. This happened years ago, and he's still alive at 70 because I didn't tell him the truth, says Collins. Contrast that with his second case, the urbane lawyer who had pain in his shoulder. And this lawyer said, I can handle the truth. I must know the truth in my business. And Collins said, stupidly, I believed him. And I told him, you've got intense and extensive kidney disease. Now, Collins said, actually, if he'd made radical changes in lifestyle, he could have been saved. Changed his diet drastically. But this guy, turns out, couldn't handle the truth and died. He says, the light of life began to flicker from the fear that my words engendered. And within 2 months it sputtered and died out. He was the last person in the world to whom the truth should have been told. Had I lied to him and then intrigued with his family and friends, he might be alive today. So Collins is saying that he regrets telling the truth. He had a moral duty to lie to this guy. That's clearly paternalistic. Other cases, the Cataract Cases. We've already talked about the midlife artist turned advertiser, where Collins lied to him and said the advantage of that was that he was able to have a year to really get going in his advertising business, make some money to set his family up, and then he drops dead. Whereas if he told him, no, you're going to die within a year, he said, had he been told the truth, black despair would have been thrown over the world. And he wouldn't have achieved as much. You have to wonder. See, this is something that a defender of autonomy would say. How do you know, Mr. Collins? And Collins would say, 40 years of practice. I've seen many, many patients. So even if he does know, the defender of autonomy would say it's not your right to decide for somebody else. Then we have the young professor, who illustrates this phenomenon that Collins points out of people who, when they're not sick, really demand to know the truth and won't hear that they're not sick. But when they really are sick, They don't really want the truth, and in fact, they can't handle the truth. The Cataract Cases, that illustrates what he claims, that the truth, telling the truth is kind of impossible in those cases, because for some people, cataracts, you can see a cataract starting, but it might not develop. Now notice, at the time, cataracts were incurable, and that it meant that you would go blind. Now cataract surgery is like that. And while they fix your cataracts, they'll fix your eyesight and give you, if you needed glasses, as I do, I'm very myopic, they'll fix your myopia at the same time. But at the time, cataracts meant that you were going to go blind, except not in all cases. So telling people you're going to go blind, says Collins, better to lie to them, because if they told they're going to go blind, they'll be miserable, and maybe they won't anyway. Of course, what Higgs would say is, well, telling the truth would be telling them that. But whereas Collins says, no, you don't want to give them too much information, you just want to tell them the best case scenario so they're happy. And then, of course, we have the young engineer who married a lesbian, and the truth that Collins gets telling is that being a lesbian is not a disease, so it can't be cured, because the engineer wanted to hear that his wife could be cured and she would come back to him. But no, she regrets. In the letter she says, look, I don't know why I married you, I regret it, you just sort of bowled me over, but really I don't like men that way. And he kills himself. So once again, to sum up, Collins's argument is very paternalistic and very consequentialist. He says you've got to try and ensure the best result for your patient, and this might involve lying to them. This might involve manipulating them. And manipulating is perfectly justifiable if it's in their own best interest. And this is the kind of thing that is red rag to a bull to someone who advocates autonomy. You just cannot do that. Okay, so let's look at Roger Higgs's discussion. In this, he points out that, he gives a quote from someone who is clearly of the same opinion as Collins, Lawrence Henderson, who in 1955, which is later than Collins, wrote, "It is meaningless to speak of telling the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth to a patient, because it is a sheer impossibility. Since telling the truth is impossible, there can be no sharp distinction between what is true and what is false." That's a slick little argument if ever I heard one. And Higgs nicely points out what's wrong with it. Just because we may not know we cannot predict exactly the future. We cannot predict whether or not a condition will be fatal, or exactly how long it will take to develop, or whether or not a cure will develop. Just because we cannot know that doesn't mean that we're allowed to say things that we know are false. So just because we don't know the whole truth doesn't mean that we can lie, that we can deliberately deceive. We can still tell exactly what we know. We can say, as Higgs said, saying "I don't know" is perfectly truthful and sometimes helpful. And on page 623, Higgs makes it clear that he's an advocate of autonomy. He says there's a relationship between three principles. The principle of veracity, that is, that you should tell the truth. And this is related to two other principles, autonomy and consent. And autonomy he defines as making a free choice for oneself, which is, a core part of autonomy, being able to decide for yourself. He also points out something that is relevant to the next section, which is that your consent is not real if it is not given on the basis of the full truth. So if you consent to something because you have not been given relevant information, or you've been told things that are actually false, then your consent doesn't bind. If you've been lied to and you sign a contract, or a contract, is presented to you on the basis of something false, the contract is not binding. So consent, the kind of consent to treatment, for example, shouldn't count and cannot be appealed to by doctors who defend themselves in malpractice suits if the patient was lied to. So telling the truth and autonomy and consent are all bound up together, Higgs points out. And Higgs tells the story of students who actually argued against telling the truth, but then a couple of them discovered that for both of them, their father died when they were very young, 6, I think. And in one case, the father lied about the death of the mother, and the student ends up saying, "I never forgave him." And this is the same person who's advocating lying. It's hypocritical. And later on, he cites another study which shows that doctors, when asked, "Would you like the truth told to you if you had to be treated by another doctor?" they all say yes, even the ones that say that they think you should lie to patients. So, 2 essential points Higgs makes on 622 and 623. It's the intention that matters. Sometimes doctors, for example, will defend themselves by saying, "I didn't lie, I just omitted some truths." As, for example, Collins does in the story of the case of the midlife artist turned advertiser. Collins explicitly says, "I told him in great detail about what the surgery he had done had achieved. What I didn't say is that obviously there was plenty of cancer left, that the surgery had not removed it all, and that cancer was going to kill him." So he defended himself in that respect. I didn't really lie. But of course, what Higgs says is no. Failing to tell the truth with the intention of misleading is just as bad as lying. It's the intention that counts. And in this, he sounds a lot like Immanuel Kant, who stresses that intentions are what counts. The other essential point that he makes on page 622 is that doctors should be held to the same standards as regular people. Doctors can't say, because of my profession, I get a special right to lie. No, he says medical ethics are part of general morality. That is, if it is wrong in everyday life to lie, it is wrong for a doctor to lie too. And that's something that I think all of the ethicists we've read would agree. He does say that there are 2 exceptions, and these are the 2 extremes of a situation. One is where there's a crisis when life is ebbing and truthfulness will bring certain disaster. So in saying that, Higgs is saying, well, I guess there is, paternalism comes in extremes. Someone like Kant would not allow that. Kant, for example, said that you are never allowed to lie, even in the most extreme situations. And the other extreme is where it's a perfectly trivial case, such as, if somebody calls in the middle of the night and the doctor is woken up and the patient said, "I hope you don't mind me calling at this hour." Obviously you do mind, you the doctor, but if you say, no, it's all right, that's okay, says... so that's what it used to be called, still is, I guess, a little white lie, because it's allowable because it's not important, he says. But in the vast middle area between crisis and trivia, you're held to the same standard as regular people, says Higgs. Now, Higgs then goes through three main arguments commonly used to defend lying. First one, which is not actually one that Collins brings up, but it is a very common one that is brought up, is the difficulty of conveying technical subject to patients. Now, this is actually relevant to the topic of informed consent. Sometimes it's argued that getting truly informed consent from patients is impossible because they don't understand what exactly they're consenting to, because it's impossible to convey that. Sometimes it's too technical, and sometimes patients just don't have the mental capacity for it. In this context, Higgs is talking about it as an excuse for lying to patients. He says, in response, arguing against this as an excuse, he says, the whole truth may be impossible to attain, but truthfulness is not. This is the same distinction he made earlier. I do not know can be a major piece of honesty. As I said earlier, that saying I do not know is important. The second point, he says, okay, it may be very difficult to explain it, but too bad. That just means you got to practice. It's like a difficult piece of music. You don't, play the simple parts and say, and this is a difficult part, so I'm just going to skip it. No, you have to practice that. So as part of the job, so in other words, it's part of a doctor's job to be truthful to a patient. That's something that separates him from Collins. Collins says, look, our job is to save the patients. We haven't time for such niceties as telling them the truth. And what Higgs is saying is, no, you're not just there to do what's medically best for them. You have to treat them as people. They're not just machines that you're supposed to fix. You're not like a mechanic. Mechanics don't have to tell the truth to what they're working on because it's just a thing. Whereas what doctors are doing is they're dealing with real people. And even they can't just treat them as bags of meat that they can lie to. Or, doctors are not like vets. Vets can't get informed consent from their patients because the animals don't understand. But the doctors and nurses, human physicians are different. And that's something that is part of the job description. So, as part of your job, it's part of your job to get good at trying to convey difficult matters. It's just like teachers are supposed to. If you've got to teach a complicated thing, you can't just throw it out there and say, if you get it, well, good, but if you don't, what can you do? Teachers have got to try and find ways of breaking it down or useful analogies. And actually you see that in public health experts speaking in this time of the pandemic. There's the chief medical officer of Ohio is particularly good at this. I've forgotten her name, but she's sort of a cult hero in Ohio, and she is very good at giving analogies. She's always wearing a white lab coat, and she does lots of hand gestures. Look her up online. I think her last name is Acton. But she's very good at giving metaphors to try and illustrate exactly why sheltering in place is important and that kind of thing. Doctors should be like that. The second argument used to defend lying is no patient likes hearing depressing or frightening news. This is Collins's view. And in fact, he argues that it's bad. Actually, this and part three, the third argument. So no patient likes hearing it. This is where Higgs says there are perhaps a fifth of patients who, if given information, deny having been told. This might be Collins's third category of patients who are wholly incapable of receiving the truth. But, in contrast, a study of those who could have a diagnosis of cancer showed that 2/3 to 3/4 of them were either glad to have been told or said that they would wish to know. Of course, Collins would say, yeah, they say they would wish to know, but I know better. More importantly, Higgs says, surveys showed that most doctors wish to be told the truth. So it's kind of hypocritical if they lie to their patients. Now, Higgs gives an interesting suggestion here. He says doctors are more afraid of death than the general public. He implies that this certainly seems to be true in the pandemic, where all the doctors are tearing their hair out and saying, no, go back inside, put on a mask, stay socially distant, stop rallying and going to the beaches, you idiots. Whereas all the other people are saying, if I die, at least I got to go to the beach and have my hair done. And Higgs suggests that, like police with violence or firemen with fire, doctors see death as the enemy and are sort of obsessed with defeating it. So firemen are much more super cautious about fire hazards and things like that, and police are, very wary of violent individuals, or possibly violent individuals, and won't let their kids go out after dark and things like that. Whereas your average person might be more prepared to die. We see this in cases where doctors push chemotherapy on cancer patients, and some cancer patients say, look, I've had one round, it was horrible, I don't want to do that again, I am okay with dying. And most physicians won't hear that. They will say, no, you've got to have treatment, because they see it as their goal. They see it as failure if the patient dies, whereas the patient might be prepared to accept that. So this is what Higgs is saying, that doctors and nurses are less accepting of death than perhaps the patients themselves. The third argument given, commonly used to defending lying, is that truthfulness can actually do harm, and this is, of course, a couple of Collins's cases, like the guy with the lesbian wife and the lawyer who had extensive kidney disease. And he says that in any medical school you hear stories of people committing suicide after having been told bad news. But, he says in response to this is likely just a rationalization of physicians' fear of telling unpleasant truths, and notes that physicians would rather do invasive surgery than tell the truth to a patient. So clearly they have a horror of it. Second, even if it's true that these people committed suicide, we don't know that they committed suicide because of the news. Maybe they committed suicide, maybe it was just the style of the delivery. So maybe you get better at telling bad news. Or maybe it was the fear of the treatment rather than truth. Obviously that doesn't apply to the guy with the lesbian wife, but it could be the case with the lawyer, that he just couldn't face the treatment, even though the treatment probably would have saved him, according to Collins. And the final point that Higgs makes, is that lying is corrosive. It has a bad effect not just on the family, but also on society. And it means that you don't trust doctors. If you find out your doctors have been lying to you, you're not going to trust them. And if you want to point to a corrosive effect on society, look at the anti-vaxxers, who are now preemptively saying that even if the vaccine for COVID-19 is made, they're not going to take it. Why? Because they claim that doctors haven't been truthful about what's in these vaccines. Now, whether or not that's true, that doctors haven't been truthful, that people having these beliefs has resulted from certainly some people being untruthful, like Andrew Wakefield, the the typhoid Mary of the anti-vaxxer movement, who published the article claiming that a particular MMR vaccine caused autism. That was a flat-out lie right there, and that has led to horrific consequences of people dying of measles because they won't get vaccinated, or their children. Okay, so Higgs gives some elements of arguing for autonomy. He explicitly mentions autonomy as related to truth-telling, the principle of veracity and consent. He qualifies it a little for the extremes, where he says in a crisis you can lie if it's a desperate situation. A true dyed-in-the-wool defender of autonomy would say, no, you can't really do that. Maybe they would say you can restrain the patient or just knock them out in that situation, but you can't lie to them. The passage that on page 626 that sort of sums up Higgs' argument says, in summary, there are some circumstances in which the health professions are probably exempted from society's general requirements for truthfulness. Those are the extremes. But not telling the truth is usually the same as telling a lie. It's the intentions that matter. And a lie requires strong justification. We should always aim to respect the other important principles governing interactions with patients, especially the preservation of patients' autonomy. There you go. All right, so that's truth-telling. Now we move on to informed consent. And we've already seen how consent is related to autonomy and truth-telling, as Higgs made clear. And your first reading is a work of pure philosophy, a classic by John Stuart Mill on liberty. Mill is universally regarded as a great philosopher and a utilitarian philosopher. Let's look at some of the things that he says. So, he says, the object of this essay, that's on liberty, which is really a small book, is to assert one very simple principle, as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual. Now, society includes government, but it also includes sort of public opinion. Mill stresses greatly the role of public opinion and cultural values, not just legal norms, as shaping individuals. Okay, this principle is supposed to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control. Obviously, it's society controlling the individual. Whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties, that's government, or moral coercion of public opinion, that's the second element. Here's the principle. The sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering in the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power may be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. So this is a clear anti-paternalistic principle, because paternalism is exactly controlling people for their own good. And what Mill is saying is you're not allowed to do that. Now he does qualify this. He says you are allowed to do that, or children or people who cannot control themselves, for example, the mentally handicapped or mentally ill. This principle doesn't apply. And rather alarmingly, particularly for Victorian times when the British Empire was at its height, he says it doesn't apply to those backward states of society, which presumably he means inferior cultures, like the kind that England was always invading in those days. And there, he says, despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting that end. That is paternalistic. So he says you can be paternalistic to people who are not capable of autonomy. Now, who are those? I mean, that gives doctors great leeway. If they say, so for example, what a physician could say is, sure, I will treat people autonomously, but remember, all the people who come to see me are under great stress. They're terrified. They think they're going to die. These are people who are not autonomous because of these unique situations. So Mill gives me carte blanche to manipulate them, as Collins suggests. So that is a loophole, and Mill, I think, would disagree with that, but certainly that little passage allows wiggle room for people who look for it. Another important part of Mill's argument is he says his defense of liberty is not based on rights. Now, it makes an important distinction between him and someone like Kant or the framers of the Constitution, because rights, which is another very important concept in ethics and bioethics, rights are absolutist. That is, if I have a right to free speech, then rights do tend to be absolute. Again, free speech is sort of... there are some interesting cases. For example, even the First Amendment right of free expression doesn't extend to, famously, shouting fire in a crowded theatre. But in most cases, my First Amendment rights allows me to say something false, allows me to say very offensive things. The ACLU, which is regarded, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is regarded as a liberal institution, once defended a group of American Nazis' right to march through Skokie, Illinois, which was a predominantly Jewish suburb of Chicago. So it's a very offensive thing, and this was, when a lot of the people living there were Holocaust survivors. It was in the 70s. If you've ever seen the Blues Brothers, there's a reference to that, where they see a bunch of Nazis marching. It's a reference to this famous march of Skokie, Illinois. And the ACLU defended the Nazis' right to do that, even though they thought the Nazis were horrible and appalling people, and they think Nazism is absolutely indefensible. They said that they had the First Amendment right to do so. So rights tend to be absolute, and not your right to do something doesn't depend on good effects that result from it. You just have that right. And Mill's saying, no, I'm not going to use that. I'm not going to say that you have a right to autonomy. I'm going to say that autonomy, I'm arguing for autonomy because I think treating people autonomous has good consequences. And this is where his utilitarianism comes out. He says, I regard utility as the ultimate appeal in all ethical questions. I am a utilitarian. But not like Jeremy Bentham, the original utilitarian, his dad's best friend. It's not simplistic. He says it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded in the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. Wow, there's a lot packed into that phrase. So utility means that he's a consequentialist. But in the largest sense, here he probably means that he doesn't think of utility as simply pleasure. If you remember from the lecture on Unit 1, a common criticism against Bentham's style of utilitarianism is that you could defend lobotomizing someone provided you kept them happy, because utilitarianism says maximize happiness for all affected. Well, suppose the best way to keep someone ecstatically happy was, to remove all sorts of worries by making them incapable of thinking of worries, and just, hop them full of drugs or something like that. That's a way to maximize happiness. Mill would say, no. That's not utility in the largest sense. Utility in the largest sense would be that there are some higher pleasures that are distinctively human that are much more valuable than simple bodily pleasures, which is what Bentham was concerned with. So in the largest sense means including inculcating in people the ability to use their brains, making them appreciate music, appreciate friendship, the kind of things that are distinctively human. So that might be in the largest sense. And then in the permanent interests of man as a progressive being, Mill has what is sometimes called perfectionist elements to his theory. That is, he has a view of humankind as having a true nature that should be allowed to flourish, and furthermore, humankind should always be striving to get better. our generation should be better than the generation before, should be better than the generation before. More peaceful, more loving, smarter. All of these things should be growing all the time. And he thinks that allowing people autonomy is the best route to achieve this growth, partly because it's like the argument that people give for the free market. Free market leads to innovation. Why? Because you have all these different people trying out different things. If you just have the state in charge of making things, they'll keep making the same thing again and again. But if you have like Elon Musk on the one hand trying to make rockets and Jeff Bezos on the other trying to make rockets, they'll compete and they'll come up with the better rockets than they would have otherwise. So allowing people free choice and autonomy has the same effect. It's good for humankind in general. Now, another thing that we should qualify, that sort of slightly qualifies Mill's claim, because it sounds like Mill's principle, which is often called the harm principle, is usually summarized by saying, the only time I'm allowed to interfere with your freedom is to prevent harm to others. So if you want to tattoo yourself, I can't stop you. If you want to take drugs, if you want to take recreational drugs like LSD, I can't stop you. That's your business. So this is the sense of liberty, that I'm allowed a great range of liberty in doing what I want to do. If I want to have gay sex, you're not allowed to legislate that. So Mill would have been opposed to the laws against marijuana, the laws against gay sex, which were on the books until comparatively recently, and still are in some states. Laws against all kinds of behavior. He says, no, if it doesn't harm anybody else, it's up to you. Now, so of course, he would be opposed to pedophilia, for example, because one of the restriction is you can only you're only allowed to interact with other people if they can consent, if they consent to what they're doing. And children are not capable of consent. But if two adults of the same sex want to have sex, go for it. Now, there are weird cases where you might wonder, well, what about necrophilia? The other person involved is dead. Is that okay? Because they're not, you're not harming anyone because they're dead already. I don't know what Mill would say about that. Or what about the case, this was an actual case in Germany, where a guy advertised that he wanted to kill and eat somebody, and would somebody volunteer? And somebody did. They showed up and said, yes, I'm okay with you killing me and eating me. So he did. He killed him and ate him. And the police came and arrested him. And there were no actual laws on the books against cannibalism in Germany at the time. Is that okay? Mill would probably be opposed to that, because although you are allowed... he says essentially killing yourself undercuts your freedom. There are certain preconditions that are necessary for you to exercise your freedom, and being alive is one of them, so we can prevent you causing your death. Now that might indeed be relevant in the coronavirus. So people want to go out without masks and gather in beaches and restaurants in a way that could be fatal. What would Mill say about that? This is where his utilitarianism might be relevant, and he might say, well, actually what he would say in that case is you're going to cause harm to other people. You're going to spread the disease. You might be a carrier. Even if you're not harmed, you could be one of the people who doesn't show symptoms but is a carrier, and you could cause death to any number of other people. So the harm principle actually justifies lockdowns. Now he he does say there are many positive acts for the benefit of others that you can be compelled to perform. So it's not just that we can prevent you from doing harm to others. We can force you to help others. Now this is something most libertarians would be with Mill up to this point. Political libertarians like Rand Paul and Ron Paul. They usually say, I should have the freedom to do what I want, but they are definitely opposed to being made to help others. But this is what Mill says on page 632. Giving evidence in a court of justice, bear your fair share in the common defence, or any other joint work necessary to the interest of the society in which he enjoys the protection, and to perform certain acts of individual beneficence, that means helpfulness or being good to others, such as saving a fellow creature's life or interposing to protect the defenceless against ill usage. There are laws called Good Samaritan laws that say if you witness a crime and you do not intercede to help in ways that don't threaten your life, then you can be punished. If you've ever seen the sitcom Seinfeld, that's the plot of the last episode. The gang just laughs as they watch a fat guy get held up, and they do it in a state that has a Good Samaritan law, and they get sent to prison. But they're all jerks anyway. That's kind of the point of Seinfeld. So it's very interesting to note that Mill, who otherwise a lot of libertarians would think is on their side, because he's a utilitarian, he allows that you can be forced to help others. Then there's a discussion of three regions that he's going to discuss. Here, three major sections of his book discuss these regions. The domain of consciousness, you must be free to think what you want, say what you want. That's liberty of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, and publishing. Liberty of tastes and pursuits. This is of doing as we like, of living life as you like, of experimenting with drugs or wearing crazy clothes or being a nudist or something like that. And liberty to unite with others. You should have the freedom to mix with people of a like mind, freedom to congregate, the kind of thing that is banned in authoritarian regimes because they don't want you getting together and rebelling. Those are three very important areas of human liberty that he has a whole section on. And he sums up by saying, no society in which these liberties are not on the whole respected is free, whatever may it be its form of government. So even if you're a democracy, if there are laws against... So, for example, United States has always been a democracy, but in the time of Prohibition, it wasn't a free country, according to Mill. And obviously it wasn't a free country in the time of slavery. But under Prohibition, or even marijuana Prohibition, which was very recently true, it wasn't a free country because people weren't free in these three areas. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as good as seems to the rest. So he's very much opposed to paternalism. If your patient decides against treatment, that's their choice, and it's not your position to force them. Okay. Then we get a famous court case, Schlendorf versus New York Hospital. Now, the circumstances of this, which were not explained in the article, are these. In January 1908, Mary Schlendorf was admitted to New York Hospital to evaluate and treat a stomach disorder. Some weeks into her stay at the hospital, the house physician diagnosed a fibroid tumor. The visiting physician recommended surgery, which Schlendorf adamantly declined. She consented to an examination under anesthesia. During the procedure, during the examination that she'd consented to, the doctors performed the surgery to remove the tumor. So they were acting paternalistically. They said, look, she didn't consent to this, but we've got her here. This will save her life. So we're going to save her life whether she wants it or not. Afterwards, she developed gangrene in the left arm, ultimately leading to the amputation of some fingers, and she blamed the surgery and filed suit. The result was, or as part of the decision, the famous Judge Benjamin Cardozo wrote, Every human being of adult years and sound mind, not a child, not mentally incapacitated, has a right, notice he's using the language rights, which Mill doesn't, a right to determine what shall be done with his own body, and a surgeon who performs an operation without his patient's consent commits an assault for which he is liable in damages. Note the language of liability, which Beecham talks about in his article. This is true except in cases of emergency, so again, like Higgs, saying that crises are an exception. Where the patient is unconscious, obviously you can't get consent then, and where it is necessary to operate before consent can be obtained. So if you can obtain consent, you have to. And that's early 20th century. Now, Beecham, informed consent. Okay, we saw already how Higgs said that consent is related to autonomy. And Beecham discusses two standards of informed consent on page 637. And he argues that the better kind, the one that is the morally best standard, is one where there is autonomous authorization by individual patients or subjects of research. That is the ideal standard. So right there, it's autonomous. He's saying that we should treat patients and subjects as autonomous agents and respect that. And that is what we are. That is the point of informed consent. The reason why you have to get not just consent, but consent that is informed. So in other words, they weren't lied to and they were told all the truth, is because we have a duty to respect the autonomy in our patients or subjects. That's the best kind of informed consent. What we actually have, he says, is the second kind, where the standards of informed consent are shifting, and they are just whether or not you got informed consent is given depends on the rules of a particular institution. So they might define informed consent as signing your name, asking them, being given a certain questionnaire or something. Now, that's not necessarily good enough. That could, if the right institution sets up the right rules, that could match up with it. But the second kind is what tends to be focused on in lawsuits, because if a lawsuit happens, how does the physician defend themselves? They would say, I followed the rules. The rules say this is what consent is. I got that. They signed their names. I asked them a question. They said yes. That's all that the rules require of me. So therefore I got consent. And if the enforcement mechanism of getting informed consent is like lawsuits and litigation and standards of negligence, all legal enforcement, then of course you're going to get the second standard, because once the lawyers get involved, they want a document to pick at. And doctors are going to say, look, I just give me the rules and I'll follow them, and that's all I can be held to. And what Beecham stresses is, no, you're making it about the law. You're making it a legal standard. We should make it a moral standard. The reason why we care about informed consent is because we have a moral duty to respect the autonomy of patients or subjects. Now, there's a little bit of history that you can go into of how right up until the mid-20th century, it was the point of view of the patient was not really considered. The point of view, it was all, medical ethics was all about the doctor's duty to care for his patients. Exactly the attitude that Collins gives in the first article that we read. Remember, he's writing in the early days of the 20th century. But in a landmark case that introduced the term informed consent in 1957, Salgo versus Leland Stanford Jr., University Board of Trustees, the court argued for a duty to disclose the risks and the alternatives of treatment, and raised both the issue of whether consent had been given and also whether or not the consent was adequately informed. It's not enough just to ask and have them say yes. You have to know that they understand what you're saying. And then in 1972, another very influential case called Canterbury versus Spence, Judge Spotswood Robinson. I think you can only be a judge if you've got an awesome name. He wrote that the patient's right of self-decision shapes the boundary of the duty to reveal. So in other words, you shouldn't reveal just as much as the guidelines of your institution say. You shouldn't just do the bare minimum of what the law requires. How much you should reveal should be governed by the person that you're dealing with. If you think that the person needs a bit more explaining to, then you need to go that extra mile. If someone is another doctor, then you don't need to say as much. That you know that they will understand. You can just say, well, what about this? And informed consent is easy to get. But if it's someone who, who dropped out of high school or, has grown up in an Amish country or something, then you might have to take a lot more time to convey to them what they're consenting to before their consent counts as informed. And he looks at challenges to informed consent, the limits of the law, the quality of consent. We need to be focusing on the understanding of the patient, as I just said, rather than the mere fact that they gave consent. And the limits of the law, that's his complaint that because medical ethics didn't introduce the idea of informed consent. According to medical ethics was just all from the physician's point of view, and it just said you've got to try and save these patients. It basically treated the patients as a vet treats an animal patient. And it was only introduced from the outside in cases like the one Schlendorf, this idea of informed consent. So because it was the law that introduced the idea of informed consent, doctors have been reacting to informed consent as if it's a legal standard, as if it's just something, another law we have to follow. I guess I will follow it to the bare minimum. What do the rules of my institution say? What are we legally required to do to get informed consent? That's why most physicians, he says, have the wrong attitude to informed consent, that it's just an imposition from the law. The focus should not be in avoiding illegality. It should be on being ethical, on respecting your patient's autonomy. A specific problem to informed consent is broad consent, and he uses a very interesting case study of banking of samples. That is, of getting samples, medical samples. So if you're doing a study, and he says one of the problems with getting samples is now you can get samples from all variety of sources, not necessarily directly from the person who donated the sample. The person can donate a sample to a university or to the government or to industry, or people could get some. Think of 23andMe, or think of data mining. You're getting exactly analogous things in data mining, like your information is acquired when you do Google searches, and Google sells that information to companies. And privacy advocates say, no, Google shouldn't be allowed to sell that information. Same thing is happening with medical samples. Or 23andMe gave genetic information to the FBI or to law enforcement. That's actually how they caught the Golden State Killer. That they were able to use this vast database to find out, to trace a cousin of the Golden State Killer, and then they worked out, well, one of their suspects is related to this person, and this is the DNA from a hair or something. So, samples, people can acquire samples not necessarily directly from the individual, and then they just do with them what they will. What he suggests is no, if you're one of these people and you acquire a sample not from the original person, you're only allowed to do research that they consented to, the original donor consented to, and if you want to do research that they didn't consent to, you have to get new consent. And he gives an example of where this didn't happen, of the Havasupai Indians who live in the Grand Canyon, who consented to have genetic material tested for diabetes research, but it ended up being used because it was collected by Arizona State University. All these different researchers in Arizona State said, ooh, let me at that. I've got all kinds of interesting research. Mental illness, a guy was interested in schizophrenia, working out their geographical origins by doing DNA analysis, and that opened up a huge can of worms, because the person published a paper claiming to show that they weren't indigenous, that they crossed the Bering Strait to get there, and the tribe's whole culture was based on the idea that they were indigenous to this to the Grand Canyon, and that's what their legal right for staying in the Grand Canyon was based on. And also there were a paper saying that there was a great degree of inbreeding, which they found offensive. So all of these culturally very insensitive and very insulting and legally dangerous results were gotten from research on genetic material that they did not approve research for that purpose. Now, he says, as a result of things like that, better standards of informed consent are in place. But now you've got a dichotomy between the relatively high standards of consent for research and still much lower standards of consent for treatment, for when you visit a doctor, for whether or not they give you a certain drug or something like that. You can be given a drug without being told. They can try treatment on you without necessarily getting your consent. He says that it should be the same. The only reason it's different is because lawyers have gotten more involved in the case of research. He says, perhaps today patients are underprotected and research subjects overprotected. One dimension of the problem is whether we should have government regulatory systems for research, but no comparable systems for the regulation of practice. He says that's got to be corrected, because the law should affect the morality, and the morality in the morality in both research and treatment is the same. It's the morality of respecting the autonomy of the individuals. And that should do it.